Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. George Grisham here, speaking with you from Valencia, Spain. And what am I speaking about? History. History of Spain, history of the proud kingdom of Valencia, and of our little town, Denia, where I used to live. This is a series of lectures or talks which we have been doing with you for the last probably 8 months. And this one is quite interesting because it starts in the 18th century and it covers the interconnections of 3 or 4 royal dynasties: Bourbons, Stuarts, Hannovers, Romanovs in Russia. It also speaks about the famous families of Churchills, Spencers, who who were the people who connected all of this. We are going to speak about one of the most noble families in the whole of Europe between 18th and 21st centuries. Their titles are the Dukes or Duchesses of Alba, Dukes or Duchesses of Berwick, Lyria, Fitz-James. So who were they? Where did they live? What did they do? First, let me reintroduce myself and my wife, George and Catherine Grisham. We actually work in insurance. Our company is called Oakshott Insurance. We're Lloyd's of London brokers. I've been working in marine insurance, in non-marine insurance and reinsurance for the last 37 years. But always we've been doing some education. We were doing, for instance, in Kyiv for the last 21 years, we were doing free seminars. Most of the Ukrainian, Russian, Kazakhstani markets were present at our seminars. Then I was doing books on insurance. I've done 3 big ones, 2,500 pages. And we work with all these very nice people, with Barry and Samson, 25 years in the same company. Len van der Poot has been helping us with historical and linguistic input for the last 22 years. We are based in London, in Valencia, where I'm here, in Kyiv. We used to have an office in Almaty. We have an affiliated company in St. Petersburg, Russia. So insurance was not enough for me. And some 8 years ago, I switched into writing and talking about history, geography, travel, because Dania, a tiny town with 50,000 population, has 2,500 years history. I wrote 2 books, 500 pages, 560 years of Dania's, Valencia's, and Spain's history, starting from 1230. And then because it was too big, I decided to do a smaller book. I did it in 4 languages, well, with the help of Len van der Poot and Tony Mahoney in English, with the help of 7 friends of ours in Spain, and so forth, Spanish. So the books are Divne Dania in Russian, Delightful Dania in English, Dania Divina in Spanish, and Dying Dania in German. And then I started 2 YouTube channels, one on insurance and the other one on history, geography, travel. It's very easy to find. In YouTube, we just look for George Grisham History. And what's good, all the installments there are in 2 languages, most of them, okay, in Russian and separately in English. And they cover the history of at least 3 levels: Denia, local history; Valencia, the history of a kingdom; and Spain. Now, we are talking about 18th century and its connection with our world, 21st century. In the very center, in the very heart of Madrid, there's a place called Valyria Palace, with one of the largest collections of art in Spain and in Europe. Of course, not as large as the Prado collection, the Thyssen-Bornemisza, but still. To get there, you need to buy a ticket well in advance. But let's just suppose that we visited Prada and we still have time, money, energy to visit the Palace of Liria. Of course, we'll have to get some snack on our way, but we walk out of Prado, turn right, go up the Prado Boulevard, turn left, into Gran Via, one of the most beautiful streets of the central Madrid with all those theaters, musicals, past the Callao, one of the tourist centers, go down the hill, see the monument to Cervantes, to Don Quixote, to Sancho Panza on our left, and then go up to the Palacio de Liria on our right. In photos, it will be like this. We start with Prado, number one, go into the Cibeles Square with the wedding cake building of Carreos. So now it's a cultural center. It's very nice to have a look at the top. Bank of Spain, Gran Via, Callao Square, Plaza de España, and finally Palacio de Liria. When you will be looking at all those paintings, you won't miss this one. A beautiful small girl riding a horse, strangely enough, with some Disney characters. Who is she? She was one of the most famous persons in the European nobility. Maria del Rosario Caetana Fitz-James Stuart de Silva, 18th Duchess of Alba, lived in 1926-2014. You can see how she looked during her life. Yes, well, a plastical surgery didn't do her good, but it didn't actually change her character. She was always joyful. See, there she is joking with Camilla. There she is dancing in in her 18 years. Sometimes she was wearing tiara la russa, a Russian tiara. Why? What's the connection? On its own time. Let's enjoy the photos of La Caetana. And she was called La Caetana II, the 18th Duchess of Alba. And also look at her father, the 17th Duke of Alba. He was the first ambassador of Franco's Spain in Britain during the Second World War. He was a very famous person in the British high society. For instance, he is here with Winston Churchill, 1914. Here is Caetana II with Her Majesty the Queen, Elizabeth II. So this strange combination. Caetana's father was called Jacoba Fitz-James Stuart, Jacob or James. So why this strange mixture of Spanish and English? Well, we have to go back to the 18th century, to the War of the Spanish Succession. Pan-European War. We could call it the First World War. France and Spain on one side, nearly all other countries on the other side. What it was all about? Dynasties. We had Habsburgs in Spain between 1516 and 1700. Charles II, he is Carlos II, died childless in 1700. And there were two pretenders. Bourbons, the French dynasty, and the Habsburgs, the Austrian-German Holy Roman Empire dynasty. The war was about it. Who would be occupying the throne of Spain? On the French side, we had His Majesty Louis XIV, the Sun King, the king who built up France into the mightiest power of Europe. And he placed his grandson, Philip V, on the Spanish throne. Philip was the first Bourbon in Spain, Felipe V. He is in Xàtiva, a small town, but small, interesting fortified town, not far from Valencia. Yes, his portrait is hanging there upside down, starting from 1940. On the other side was Carlos III. No, he never became Carlos III. He became an emperor. And sometimes they speak about him as the emperor who wanted to be the king of Spain. he tried to become between 1703 and 1713. He became the emperor in 1713 and finished his days in Austria, in Vienna. So Habsburgs versus Bourbons. There was an explanation. Philip III, a Habsburg king, see his grandchildren were actually Philip V's Duke d'Anjou, the French Bourbon, and Carlos III, the Archduke of Austria. Who won? Bourbons, but not Spain. Yes, Louis XIV managed to place his grandson Philip V on the Spanish throne, but just look at the map, 1700 and 1714. Spain lost its dominions, its possessions in Europe. Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, Milano, Spanish Netherlands, they all became Austrian. Sicily first became owned by Savoy, and then Savoy got Sardinia. So Spain was only left with its lands on Pyrenees. That was the time when Britain got Gibraltar and a part of Minorca for a few years, only for 11 years. And actually Britain became Great Britain. 1700, two kingdoms, two separate kingdoms with one king, of course, Scotland and England. 1714, the United Country, Great Britain. Philip V, the longest reigning king in Spain. 1700, 1746, 46 years. Two wives, three children who became kings. Louis I, just for 1 year, then he died. Ferdinand VI and Carlos III. Carlos III I like absolutely, he's just my love, because he was a beautiful ruler, one of the best rulers Spain had in the last 300 years. He actually built the modern Madrid. But we're not speaking about Carlos. We're speaking about Philip V. Here he is, probably in La Granja de San Ildefonso. That's kind of equivalent of Spanish Versailles, not far from Madrid, northwest from Madrid, not far from Segovia, which is also worth visiting. And here is this painting. Philip V giving an order or decorating the Duke of Berwick at Palacio de Liria. Here we are, back to Valyria Palace. So we are talking about this family. The first James Fitz-James. Here he is on the left. Some Scottish blood, English aristocrat, nobility, French soldier, commander, who fought on the Spanish side, lived for 64 years, died in a battlefield. He became the first Duke of Berwick, 1687, the Marshal of France, 1706, first Duke of Lyria and Herica, first Duke of Fitz-James, Beric and Lyria. Not too nice names. Beric was always some kind of neutral territory, wasn't it? Passing between Scotland and England. And of course, Stuarts were Scottish and English kings, starting from the beginning of the 17th century. So Berwick is kind of an important place. Lyria, very much the same. James Fitz-James, the first Duke of Berwick, was the commander of Bourbon army when it started moving towards Valencia from Madrid in 1707. And it won the most important battle at Almansa. The battle at Almansa finished with the existence of the Kingdom of Valencia, which actually existed between 1238 and 1707. Yeah, that's our dog Pulga. She's moving all the time. So James Fitz-James, the Duke of Berwick, the winner at Almansa. That was quite strange that an English general, an English marshal, was the commander of a French-Spanish army. And they were fighting against English-Spanish army, whose commander was French. Anyway, Almansa, for people who live in Valencia, in Valencian state, is still a very bitter name, 300 years after. And the fact that Duke of Berwick was given the title of Duke of Lyria is also important because Lyria was the capital of a tribe or a kingdom of Editani, the ancient Iberians who lived here. So for people of Valencia, Lyria is a very, very touchy name. And the fact that an English, Scottish, French general was given the title of the Duke of Lyria, oh gosh, bitter. See, so once again, first Beric was the commander at the Battle of Almansa, 25th April 1707. The Kingdom of Valencia got suppressed. And then on 11th September 1714, he was the commander at the fall of Barcelona, Catalonia suppressed, on your right. And it was interesting. His son, here he is, the second Fitz-James Stuart, James Francis or Jacoba Francisca, was awarded the knighthood of the Golden Fleece. He was only 18 years old, but he got it in 1714, see, when his father won the battle for Barcelona. And then it was the second Duke of Lyria, Duke of Berwick, who was sent as the first ambassador of Spain in Russia. Why? Let's go around the history of this family once again. We had James II Stuart. You remember, the king who was unfortunately ousted from England in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution. He had a wife and a few mistresses, one of whom was Arabella Churchill. Yes, the sister of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. And we can then trace down his history to Winston Churchill, to Diana Spencer, and so forth. So Arabella Churchill was a mistress of King James II and a sister of the first Duke of Marlborough. James had a few official children, including James III, the old pretender. You remember there was a young pretender, born Prince Charlie as well, much later. And with Arabella, they had a few children. They were together for 10 years, one of whom was James Fitz-James. Fitz meaning the illegal son of James II, the first Duke of Berwick. Yes, our commander at Almansa and at Barcelona. And his son was the second Duke of Berwick, the first ambassador of Spain to Russia. And of course, then we can trace the blood all the way to Caetana, the 18th Duchess of Alba and 11th Duchess of Berwick, of Lyria. Once again, just to get it clear, James II Stuart, Arabella Churchill, their son, Beric first, Lyria first, Fitz-James Stuart. His son, Beric II, the ambassador to Russia, the author of a book, the ambassador to Vienna, only lived for 38 years. Beric III, they're all Lyrias, they're all Berics. So Beric III built the palace, which we visited already, the palace in the center of Madrid. More also, the palace of Moncloa, now the seat of the government, actually was owned by Beric's Lyria as well. They were all Beric's, Lyria, Fitz-Jameses. But the seventh Beric Lyria got the title of Albas, because Alba, the 13th Duchess of Alba, the first Caetana, died childless. And because of previous marriages, not of her, but of her fathers and grandfathers, the title of Dukes and Duchesses of Alba passed over to Berics. That's how the two ancient families got together. And Alba is a fantastically important family in the history of Spain, but we're not going to speak about them. We're speaking about Berics, Lyrias, Fitz-Jameses. So that's the connection. Alba the 13th, having died childless, passed over the title to 7th Beric, who was only 8 years old at that time. And then we trace the history back to down to Beric, the 10th Beric, the 18th Alba, and to our Caetana second. Bit more about Caetana first. Of course, you recognized her. Yes, she was the Duchess. The Duchess connected with Goya. One of the most famous portraits of Goya is called The White Duchess, 1795. Next year, she would become a widow. Her husband would die. And that next summer, 1796, she would spend in their southern place, Sanlúcar de Barrameda. I would thoroughly recommend you to go there, together with Goya. Were they lovers? Were they not? Who knows? But Goya paints the White Duchess, 95, the Black Duchess. She's wearing mourning for her husband, 1797. And of course, more or less at the same time, the famous Maja Desnuda, naked Maja. You have to compare the faces yourself. Official story is that the body is of Pepita Tudor, the lover of Godoy, the favorite at the court. Whether it's so or not, and just look at the interesting thing is that the clothed Maja only appeared some 5 years after the naked Maja. Well, different points of view. Anyway, having lived for 40 years, the 13th Duchess of Alba, Maria del Pilar Teresa Caetana de Silva y Silva Bazan, died childless, and the title of Alba passed over to the Berics and Lyrias family. And now, very quickly, we'll cover the big history. Why Berics why the second Duke of Berwick, the second Duke of Lyria, got himself into the snows of Russia. Spain and Austria. France, same dynasty, Habsburgs, between 1500 and 1516 and 1700. And then France for only 4 years, 1725, 1729, 1730. Why? Because after the War of Spanish Inheritance, which was Spain and France against England, the UK, Austria, the Empire, Savoy, Holland, Portugal, we've seen that Spain lost Gibraltar, lost Minorca, Sardinia, Sicilia, Naples, Milan. They wanted to regain it. And 4 years after this big war, devastating war of the Spanish inheritance, in 1718, Spain, on her own, starts a war against the Quadruple Alliance, against France, against the UK, against Austria. They lose. So Spain starts looking for friends, for allies. And the Vienna Union appears in 1725, starts. Spain and Austria. Russia joins Spain and Austria a bit later, in 1726. Why Russia joined? Well, they had different understanding of their purposes. Russia wanted help in her eternal fight with Ottoman Empire, with Turks, whilst Spain and Austria wanted Russia to get involved against England, because England, or rather the Great Britain now, were supporting Sweden. And at that time, Sweden and Russia were arch enemies. So this particular union, the Vienna Union, existed between 1725 and 1730. And this was the union of Spain and Russia and Austria. Fighting, struggling with the Hanover Union, which was France, the UK, Prussia, Sweden, and so forth. Spain started a war for Gibraltar, 1727, lost it, and then in 1729, the Treaty of Seville was signed, where Spain actually switched sides. They became allies with the UK, all right, with Great Britain, with France, against Austria, and against Russia. So why? Because Spain wanted to regain Sicily, Sardinia, Naples, Milan, and so forth. Later on, there was a war of the Polish succession. Funnily enough, during the war of the Polish succession, Spain got Parma and Naples and Sicily. During the war of Austrian succession, against Spain and France were against Austria and Russia, and so on and so forth. So this particular combination, Spain and Austria, only existed for 4 years. And because of that, Spain was also an ally of Russia. Russia, the ambassador, James Francis, Jacobo Francisca, Fitz-James Stuart, and Berwick, second Lyria, second Beric, second Fitz-James. 1696, 1738. The Knight of the Golden Fleece at the age of 18, Orden del Toison de Oro. The Grande de España de Primera Clase, 1716. Participates in war in Naples, becomes the Mariscal de Campo, the Marshal, at the age of 28, and becomes the first ambassador of Spain in Russia between December 1726 and November 1730. He took with him Ricardo Wall, who later on became a very important minister in the Spanish government for years and years. Now, the second Lyria was awarded the knighthood of the Garter, not by the English, but actually by James Stuart. Well, English as well, but living in France, in exile. He was awarded 2 highest orders of the Russian Empire. Okay, it wasn't called the Empire at that time. The Knight of the Order of St. Andrew, when he was in Russia, and the Knight of the Order of St. Alexander Nevsky, 1728. But then he was called back by Spain because Spain and Austria became enemies, and automatically Spain and Russia became enemies. So the ambassadorship was cancelled, was stopped. And the next time Spanish ambassadors would arrive in Russia would be some 30, 40 years later, during the times of Catherine the Great. Our second Lyria became an ambassador in Vienna for 3 years, and then in Naples. And he died very, very early when he was 42 years old. What he did, for us Russians, he did quite an interesting thing, because he wrote a book. The book was called Relation de Moscovia, a report about Moscow. Actually, it was a report because he wrote 500 letters to Spain, describing all sides of the Russian life in 1727, 1730. He was the first author to do it, well, from his own impressions, because he spent 3 years at the court, at the Russian court, mostly in Moscow, not in St. Petersburg, because Peter the Great moved the capital to St. Petersburg. His grandson, Peter II, moved the capital back to Moscow for a while. So for us, this book is an absolutely fantastic source of information on Russia. I won't be going into details, but just reminding you, there was Peter the Great, Pedro I, the Tsar of Russia, who first started getting called emperor, the emperor. From him, the Russian Empire started as such. Not very legally, because at that time there was only one empire, the Austrian or the Holy Roman Empire. But He was the one who created the modern Russia. Only lived for 53 years, created St. Petersburg, and did lots of important things. His wife, Catherine I, was a queen only for 2 years. He had a son from his first wife, not from Catherine, but from his wife, Evdokia Lopukhina. And actually, the son started a plot against his father. They never know whether he was assassinated or he just died in prison. But he got birth to a small guy, to a boy, who became the Tsar, the Emperor Peter II. So you can see he became the Tsar at the early age of 11 and only was on throne for 3 years. So our Beric, our Duke of Lyria, was actually dealing with Peter II. And then for a short while when Peter died, with Anna Ivanovna, the empress, the Tsarina, who was on the throne for 10 years, 1730, 1740. So once again, in his book, Lyria describes Peter, although he never saw him. You remember he came to Russia 1727. Peter died in 1725. Again, he missed Catherine I and Prince Alexei, but he was the ambassador at the court of Peter II and at the very beginning of the Tsardom, Tsarinadom of Anna Ivanovna. That's about it. I won't be explaining you all the reforms which Peter the Great did and actually which were continued by Catherine I, by Peter II, by Anna Ivanovna. These are the people with whom he was dealing, and the most important person here, first it was Menshikov, a Validor, the favorite, but he was removed in 1727. And Andrei Osterman, a German person, became one of the leading persons at the court, and he was the one who developed the idea of the union with Austria. So really, Fitz-James Stuart, the second leader, was again trying to play against Andrei Osterman, Heinrich Osterman, but in vain. The union with Austria came to be something around 1725, 1727, and actually it was going on till the First World War in 1914. So the book was interesting. He was describing quite a few things. But probably I won't be going into too many details. Thank you very much for your attention. We were speaking about the important noble family of the Dukes of Alba, the Dukes of Berwick, the Dukes of Liria, and the beginning of 18th century. Thanks a lot. Goodbye. And I hope to get back to you on some other topics. Bye.